Hello and welcome to this video on the relationship between fungi and trees. This is a well-known relationship, and most of the time it's seen as either the growth of mushrooms on trees, which is nearly always a negative effect when trees are alive, or in the other case, the mycorrhiza and how this makes trees grow better. A mycorrhiza is a symbiotic relationship between plant roots and soil fungi. You can basically think of it as mushrooms and trees getting along. The relationship is facilitated through these tiny microscopic structures called hyphae, essentially tendrils that link the tree with the mushroom fungi body. The growing body, not the fruiting body. The phenomena itself is somewhat unnecessarily complicatedly called the wood wide web. Essentially, the trees and everything else are connected via these mycorrhizae. The combination of these two events can lead to things like the exchange of water, sugars, and minerals, the transmission of various signals, not just between the tree and fungi, but between the tree and other trees, and even provide certain support between species and to offspring. There is also a very superficial, or at least very preliminary degree of research that says some trees can use the mycorrhizae as an intermediary to communicate with closely related species, and therefore allow them to understand what's going on without having to directly interact with them. There are several main types of mycorrhiza. You have your Ectomycorrhiza, which are mostly found in broadleaf and coniferous trees, and what they do is provide a sheath or a fungal hyphae that wraps around the root. Very similar to how, say, human neurons can have a myelin sheath. Then you have the Endomycorrhiza. These are also called Arbuscular. The hyphae will penetrate into the root itself, and this is essentially a direct connection between the two species. And it is arguably the most common, with up to 80% of plant species having this particular kind of mycorrhiza. You then have Ericoid, and this is perhaps the least common and highly specialized form. It's commonly seen with things like orchids. There are two types of mycorrhizal association common to trees. The arbuscular, and this is formed by fungi in the Glomericota phylum, and it's commonly seen in deciduous trees. So if your tree loses its leaves in autumn, this is what you're looking at. You then have your Ectomycorrhizae, and these are arguably less common, but they're more commonly seen in, say, edible fungi, like truffles, for instance. And they're found more frequently with coniferous trees, pines and similar, along with some hardwoods such as beech. You would presumably also find them with oak, given that oak is generally closely related to truffles, but not necessarily always so. The other types, for example, the Ericoid that we mentioned, are generally less relevant to trees, but it does make clear that there is a great diversity of them in the world. In terms of the network, we've already mentioned that you basically have mycorrhiza with hyphae, and the hyphae will facilitate that communication. It's essentially a thread connecting whatever the fungi is to whatever the tree species is. What it does that isn't so obvious is that it allows for very deep, very fine levels of penetration into the soil on a much wider scale than the plant roots allow. This is necessary as one big tree, if it was to spread its roots right throughout the soil and its area around it, wouldn't be able to work very well. It would ultimately disrupt the structure and cause it to lack its ability to stay in place. Further, as we mentioned, a connection of individuals of the same species and, to some extent, within species, along with the transmission of various different minerals, nutrients, and so on. The size of the connection can be surprisingly large, and we mean really large. Sometimes it's only a handful of trees, sometimes it's hundreds and up to thousands of trees. The largest, the honey mushroom from memory, covers an area of roughly 9 square kilometers, or somewhere in the ballpark of about 6 square miles. So we know that they're very common, and we've mentioned that the majority of species tend to be of the Ectomycorrhizae form. But understand, nearly all trees have it. About 90% of trees will have some sort of mycorrhizae, although that is somewhat, tempered by the requirement it be somewhat temperate in its area where it naturally grows, a boreal or a tropical forest, and that it's largely not in competition with agricultural crops, grassland, and tundra. Because of this, without mycorrhiza, and it's essentially the whole point of this video, most trees that we talk about would not survive for very long. They simply cannot get what they need and remain relatively connected to the world at large. The mechanism by which the mycorrhiza provide support are a little bit more complicated than just fungi provide extra nutrition. That sounds like a nice neat summary, but it's not quite true. Because of, as mentioned, the fact that the hyphae coming out of these mycorrhiza can reach beyond the root zone, they can access nutrition that the tree just cannot get access to without it. If, and this is the big if here, that weren't the case, the tree would basically need to grow much larger in terms of its root mass much quicker, and you would have a far less sustainable development of growth. Then we have things like nutrients, for example phosphorus and nitrogen. Because these aren't necessarily easily absorbed by various trees, and particularly have a low mobility in soil, you need those mycorrhiza to be able to get the nutrients extracted out of the soil and then into the tree itself. Lastly, in terms of the nutrition profile, we have micronutrients. These are basically your periodic table items that otherwise don't need a large percentage of representation, zinc, copper, iron, things like that. Because they're also at a very low level in the soil itself, you need something that can stretch out over a large area and, for all intents and purposes, catch this seemingly very scarce resource. And so mycorrhizae can achieve that with great efficacy. In terms of more basic requirements, water uptake. Even if you look at the nature of the soil, you'll notice that water tends to be everywhere in a very small amount, but in some areas it builds up a little bit more than others. These pores in the soil, or micropores as they're properly called, are where water will essentially build up more than anywhere else. And if you can tap into these areas, you can more readily extract the water from them for the tree. This is particularly important during periods, or at least long periods, without rainfall. Next we have what is perhaps more useful in terms of environmental developments, carbon exchange, and perhaps more importantly, carbon sequestering. Trees will take in CO2 along with water and sunlight, and they will produce sugars, and this will allow the tree to grow. In other cases, it will allow for the carbon to be put into the soil underneath the tree. Without the fungi to deliver nutrients and water for the process of this to occur, you're just not going to get it happening. Without this, trees do not grow. So without fungi, there is a great limitation put on the ability of trees to undergo photosynthesis and therefore produce what is needed. Finally, we have soil structure improvement. To an extent, the soil itself can be held together better with the mycorrhizae, as it does act somewhat like a net. Understand, it essentially creates small pockets of relatively reliable soil. This is soil that can hold on to a little bit of moisture, it allows for the transmission of air and everything else, but it also has the soil broken up a little bit, allowing for the tree to be able to penetrate easily with its roots. This creates a more hospitable environment and one that's more long-term stable for trees. We've spoken about the fairly direct benefits so far, and, well, they are fairly direct and fairly obvious, but the end results are, well, also somewhat direct and obvious. For example, you have an increase in nutrient water uptake and promotion of growth. Simply put, you get a larger biomass and healthier foliage in trees. They also tend to survive better under adverse conditions, whether that is nutrient-poor soil, degraded soils, or even drought. A drought and other stresses can be also better coped with on a much larger scale and for longer. This is sometimes put down to purely its ability to better balance everything it needs and access what it otherwise can't, but also the production of certain stress-related compounds, and these can, to an extent, mitigate damage. Then we have disease resistance. Now, it's not entirely true that it will stop all damage, but it does increase resistance, at least with regards to the roots. The simple reality is that you already have a fungi existing within the root structure, and this does provide a certain degree of shielding from other fungi and other pathogens that you do not want growing around the roots. It's, in some respects, similar to how the human body's immune system uses the intestinal tract as a training ground, where all the bacteria within our intestine provides a certain amount of, let's say, a training to the immune system because it's a foreign pathogen, but it's a foreign pathogen that we have a controlled amount of. the tree does something similar with its immune system. Because the mycorrhizae can also effectively dispose of metals, this allows it to get rid of things like heavy metals and certain pollution, or at least better tolerate them. However, it does also have the opposite effect of it can increase susceptibility to those same heavy metals and toxins if they are better facilitated by the fungi in question. We mentioned the fact that the immune system in the tree is much like the human digestive tract, and it's also true that, to an extent, the fungi provide a certain amount of, control or restrictions on other microbes within and around the tree roots. This does allow for the production and growth of certain colonies that are useful for the tree, mostly because the unneeded or excess sugars from the tree that the fungi get via the mycorrhizae tend to end up in the local area, and all the microbes that are there think, great, that's a free meal. And so you end up with not only microbes building up around the tree, but then these microbes in turn help to break down certain organic matter, leading to a circle of life scenario. In terms of sequestering carbon, we mentioned this earlier on, but it is entirely arguably the case that the mycorrhizae, because they can assist in moving unneeded or excess CO2 into the ground under the tree, can increase the sequestering of carbon in the soil, and therefore not only increase biomass of the tree, but the role that the tree plays in, to an extent, combating climate change. There is a wider effect that mycorrhizae have, and not all of this is necessarily good or bad, but you do need to be mindful of it. We've mentioned the fact that the mycorrhizae allow for communication between trees of the same species and theoretically between species. Because of this, the effect that the mycorrhizae have goes beyond just being able to communicate. For example, you want to be able to move material, say, from one big tree that is, for example, at the end of its life, and therefore breaking down, into the mycorrhizae, which can then transport it to other newer saplings or seedling trees that will allow them to grow better, essentially giving them a short-term boost. You then have an increase in biodiversity, mostly in the fact that you have a second species growing alongside the primary tree species of interest. Admittedly, the mycorrhizae itself can also be considered an independent species and the trees growing alongside it, but for most people it's the other way around. There are some threats to mycorrhiza, and the most common and perhaps the biggest for most people, especially if you're growing something at home, is going to be soil compaction and disturbance. In short, the fact that you have soil and what is for all intents and purposes a long tendril within it, you will damage that tendril through compaction. You are squishing it, crushing it, and ultimately destroying it. Disturbances are similar, except for the most part disturbances would be, say, digging in the ground, and by digging you will literally cut off that particular section of the mycorrhiza, which, well, to be blunt about it, isn't ideal. There are, let's be generous with this and say, arguments that the use of inorganic fertilizers can suppress the development of mycorrhizae, and this is only partially true, because it's a problem that's true of organic and inorganic fertilizers, not that inorganic fertilizers are really used. And it's this: excess nitrogen from some fertilizers, whether they are organic or inorganic, doesn't matter, it can cause damage, because too much nitrogen in any context can be bad. The benefits of everything we've mentioned so far, and to some extent the downsides, are going to be tempered by certain things. To start with, you have the soil itself. The reality is that this is a soil-growing species, and as such, if the soil is of poor quality, the mycorrhizae will suffer. And to an extent you could argue that excess or heavy fertilization can do the same thing, although that one's a little harder to argue. There is some specificity between the fungi species and the tree species. As such, because of that specialization, you'll often find that you need to have certain fungi to get mycorrhizae. Otherwise, you may not get what you want, because neither species will be able to make use of the other if one doesn't die off entirely. Then we have things like environmental stresses. We've mentioned things like soil compaction, but pollution, deforestation, and so on, it can all demonstrate the same sort of effects. And finally, we have management practices, at least in terms of, say, farming, and particularly for forestry. There are let's say, issues around growing certain species, or in many cases say a monoculture, and that this can have a certain effect on the mycorrhizae, and especially the fungal diversity that make up for it. So for example, if you have one great big plantation full of pine trees, poplar trees, or whatever it is you've chosen to use for your particular mainstay timber industry, you might find that this has an effect on the fungi population. On the other hand, because you have basically selected for just one particular symbiotic fungi, it could theoretically make that area much better suited to that one species of tree. Overall, mycorrhizal fungi are basically indispensable. Many trees cannot do without them. Now, you may not have very many or very much mycorrhizae fungi alongside your tree, but there's likely to be some in the soil that you're growing your tree in. And if it's not, it will be beneficial. The fungi is going to enhance the health and well-being of the tree simply because it drastically improves the ability of the tree to take up things like nutrient and water. It makes the tree that much more tolerant to stress and diseases, and it provides a certain amount of connectivity between one tree and the others, if we're talking about a group planting or, more often than not, trees in the ground. By having a wider root system, the tree can both get what it needs and dispose of what it doesn't need or want, and this can have benefits in terms of the ability to sequester carbon, and in other cases to dispose of waste products. And of course, all of this is not to be underestimated in terms of, for example, forestry, where you want to have the best growing trees under the best circumstances as quickly as possible to get maximum timber in minimum of time. This is why, for the optimum effect, mycorrhizae are a major consideration, not just in, say, hobbies like bonsai, but in a variety of other things. And as such, it is a big challenge, not just in direct and immediate terms, but in the long term. Thank you for watching this video. If you have found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.